take our minds and think through them, take our lips and speak through them, take our hearts and set them on fire with love for you. Amen. So for the last few months, I've been pulling these great big Rubbermaid crates out of my garage and trying to go through them. These are all things that years ago when I moved here and still had my house down there, I just packed it up all in these Rubbermaid crates, these things that I needed to go through because I didn't have time. And first I left them in the house, and when I sold the house, I moved them to a storage room. Then I moved them here and into my garage. And so I've decided this year I'm going to go through these crates and see what's there. So I pulled out two, and it turned out to mostly be photographs. And I got so interested in looking at the photographs, I didn't go on with any of the other crates that day. So I don't know how this is going to go. But as I looked at those photographs, they were all sorts of photographs from when the kids were born and then as they grew up. And some of them were just children, and some of them were our whole family, Jim and me and the kids. Some of them were just Jim, some of them were just me. It was just all this array of all these years. And it was interesting to see the different looks we had. How we changed over that whole span of years. And then in the midst of it, I found this envelope that had all these pictures of me from when I was a baby, from my birth picture all the way up through my adolescence. Sometimes just me, sometimes with my sisters. But I had before me then this whole range of pictures, and in the room there were some pictures of me now. I had this whole range of me from birth all the way up till now, 65 years later. And not only did I notice how much in looks I had changed, I didn't exactly look like that little baby that was born in 1950, but I also started thinking of all the different changes in my life and how I had changed and how my life had adapted and evolved to meet those changes. And yet, at the same time that I am so different at 65 from looks as that baby, and even in actions and beliefs, because that baby, didn't have much to think about at that time, still there is a spirit that was me that has continued through all of that. And sometimes you can see it in the look in my eye at whatever age, or the way I sat, or the way I stood, or something that I could just see, oh yeah, that's the me that's been there all along these times. Well, I say that to you today, on this day of Pentecost, because sometimes the day of Pentecost is referred to as the birthday of church. And we're tempted to think of the church being birthed as we know it. But when we go back and read that Acts reading that I would have to say, Shannon, you read absolutely beautifully, and got all the pronunciations of all those weird names correct. When you go back and read that, the birth of what was birthed then doesn't look exactly like the church as we know it. When I think about church, there are all sorts of images that come to mind for me, but they all seem to fit together. I tend to think of the buildings in which I went to church, and there were lots and many as I grew up, because my mother was a church organist, and so we went to church where she had a job. Barksdale Air Force Base, Presbyterian church, a Methodist church, and finally an Episcopal church where we stayed. I went to church at the Roman Catholic church with my grandmother when I would visit her in Lake Charles, or at the Methodist church with my other grandmother when I would visit her in a little town called Bunkie. So all these churches and the people in them, the buildings and the people in them, come to mind as an image of church for me. Also, I get images of particular pastors and preachers, Sunday school teachers, youth leaders. I get images of programs that we had, programs of ministry, some of them educational programs, some of them programs of ministry or mission, either inside the church or outside the church. I think of the sacraments, I think of reading scripture, I think of sermons, I think of the music, all sorts of different types of music. I think of prayer books, I think of fights over things, I think of all the things that have made the church the institution it is, which for me growing up was a very stable institution at the center of my life, a very stable institution that seemed at the center of the country and the culture at large. And it's that same church that today many feel is threatened and see in a sense of decline. But it is also not the same church that we see on the day of Christian Pentecost. On the day of Christian Pentecost, we don't see a stable institution with programs and special leaders where everybody comes together in one building and sometimes goes out. That's not what we see on that day of Pentecost. Those images are very, very different. They're images of a small, scared community of followers of Jesus, the 11 that were left with his disciples, plus the women that had followed him, gathered together in a little room, which is probably the same room where they had celebrated the Last Supper. There, because after he died and rose from the dead, he told them to go back to Jerusalem and to wait, because he would come and tell them what to do, or the Spirit, not he, but he says the advocate, the Spirit will come, the Spirit of truth, it will come and show you what to do. And so they didn't even know what they were waiting for. They were just there. They had been there every day, some of them staying there overnight, doing every day the prayers that were part of their Jewish religion, the morning prayers, the noonday prayers, the afternoon prayers, the evening prayers, the prayers before they went to bed. And on this day, they were gathered for the Jewish feast of Pentecost. Pentecost being the Greek word for it, Hebrew word being Shavuot, or weeks, because it's 50 weeks after the Passover. And whereas the Passover celebrated the exodus of the people out of Egypt, Shavuot celebrated the giving of the Torah, the giving of the law to the Hebrew people. And so there they are on a very important day in their religion, and all of a sudden, while they're just doing what they normally do, it's like a rush of wind comes in, and it's like the energy is so incredible they don't even know how to explain it, except to say it's like tongues of fire all over all of us. And the very first thing that this burst of energy does is it comes upon them without even thinking. Before they've known it, it's driven them out of the room and into the streets. And in the streets are thousands and thousands of Jewish pilgrims who've come from all over the Roman Empire to celebrate this feast of Shavuot, or of Pentecost. And because they live in all different places in the Roman Empire, they speak different languages. And so they're out into this just confusion and sea of people. And somehow they are able to communicate to them what they have seen and heard. And some of the images that we hear back are, first of all, that everybody thought they were drunk. They thought they were crazy. And it must have been confusion, holy confusion perhaps, but it must have been confusion. Have you ever been in a church where on the day of Pentecost, when they read that reading, they read it in several different languages at the same time? Well, it's amazing, but it's like confusion. You can't really hear any of them. It's just like this and this and this. It would have been like that holy confusion, except that instead of like in the story of Tower of Babel, where all the different languages separated them, in this story, all the different languages somehow unite them. And they all hear the message in the way they can hear it. All these very different people can hear it in the way they can hear it. That the power of God is being poured out among them. And that's what was birthed on the first day of the Christian church. And like us, over time, as the Christian church grew and evolved, it became more like what you and I know or think of as church. Not exactly the same. What we see threatened. And yet we hear some of our greatest thinkers today saying that what may be really happening now is not so much a threat to the church that was birthed, but the stirring of the Spirit among us to recover some of that Spirit that actually is the church that maybe has gotten covered up along the way. Some of that Spirit that was uncontainable instead of so heavily institutionalized. Some of that Spirit that was energetic instead of barely making it able to have a smile as we sit in our pews. Some of that early Spirit that was birthed, that was life-changing to those few people and later to many other people all throughout the world. I think it's very similar to the way that at 65, I look back and I want to recover some of that same spirit that I had in those early years. That I want to recover some of that same spirit of wonder instead of already thinking I know the way things are going to go. I want to recover some of that same spirit of mystery instead of having to plan it all out. I want to recover some of that same spirit of that feeling that anything is possible. And when we come alive at whatever age, that's what we want to do. We want to look past the things that have covered us up and look back to that is truly us, that spirit of truth that Jesus talked about, that spirit of reality that has been with us from the day we were born and is there somewhere still. And that's true for the church too. It's not that at any point what the church did was wrong. It grew up. But as everybody that grows up, some of what it needs to recover and some of who we are and some of where the spirit of truth that Jesus said would come and talk to us. See, Jesus didn't say, I've said everything that was going to be said, it's written down in the Bible. Jesus said, I can't tell you everything that you need to know. And therefore, I'm going to send the spirit of truth, my own spirit, and it's going to help you see things you've never seen before, that you can't even bear to hear now. Like maybe there shouldn't be slaves. That you can't even bear to hear now. That like maybe it's fine for women to be leaders. That you can't even hear now. Like maybe it's whatever the it is today that we struggle with. There are some terrific thinkers in the church who believe, and I've told some of you this before, that if you look back over the history of the church, every 500 years you'll see the Spirit of God shaking things up a bit. First century, as things move, Spirit shakes it up from being just a sect of Judaism to being a whole different religion and grows it into the institution that you see by the 5th century. In the 500s, you see that that institution is suffering because the Roman Empire that had made it the state religion has declined, has fallen, and the beginning of the Dark Ages is happening. Barbarians have come in. The church has become kind of rote business as usual, and we get the Spirit moves within people, and the rise of monasticism comes up. Monastic communities, men and women, that continue to follow more that faithful observance of hours and things that early Christians had done. 500 years later, you get to the year 1000, and you find that Christianity, Christendom itself, splits apart. It splits apart over issues of power and over issues of theology about the Spirit, interestingly enough. And you get the Eastern Orthodox Church, and you get Roman Catholicism. 500 years later, after the 1000s, you're at the 1500s, and what happens? The Reformation. At 1594, a Roman Catholic priest by the name of Martin Luther nails 95 points to be debated up and starts something he never expected to start. All he wanted was a discussion in the church, and instead we end up today with God knows how many denominations and people. 500 years later, from 1500, and where are we? Right here. It's us. And at none of those times was somebody right and somebody wrong. At none of those times did somebody know how things were going to turn out. At all of those times, when something new was happening, it looked like it was the worst thing in the world that could possibly be happening. And yet, the Spirit of God has continued to move, even when we don't want to move with it. It will push us out of that room. And so more than likely, it is incredibly possible that today we are right there, where the Spirit of God is moving in the life of the church to get us to go back and look at that Spirit that is ours, that maybe has gotten covered up with some of the things we may hold most dear. Because God's interested in the life of the church, not in the preservation of any one model of it. God's interested in the life of the church as a people of God who are willing to go out into the world and let the Spirit be poured in and through them to bring God's love to everyone in whatever the way they can and in ways that many different people can understand. So on this birthday of the church, let us celebrate the birthday of the church, but let us remember what church was birthed on that day. And let us commit our own hearts and minds to being open to the movement of that Spirit, even when it challenges some of the things we hold dear. to be willing to listen in this time that may be a wilderness roaming for us, that we may never see where this ends up. It may not happen till after we've died. And yet to know that people have been there before us. People were there as the Roman Church was formed. People were there as the Eastern Church was formed. People were there through the Reformation. People were back there as Judaism and Christianity went their separate ways. People were back there when monasticism rose, and when it fell again, people have been back there with us all along. The Spirit has been moving all along. God has been moving all along. That we might go back and reclaim the Spirit that is God's. In Christ's name.